when COVID hit in 2020, there was a huge panic from everybody. And over the past year, it's been a hard over a year and a half of, lockdowns and you're out of lockdowns and you're locked down again. Kids are in school, people are in business. No, they're back home. Everything was pretty, and even it's going on now today, wherever you are in the world, there's something going on. Overall, a lot of us who are listening to this had access to food. Most of us had access to food. But there was a time where some small island states, like the Aleutian Islands, had to worry about where food was coming from. And we have Dr. Nick Higgs, who is the director of the Aleutian Island Institute, and he is coming here to discuss, or he's on the podcast today to discuss a study that he did, sort of an ad hoc study that he did during COVID for about 12 weeks. And he really looked at what was going on with people trying to access food from the sea, because they always had the sea, and that's free. So we'll see what happens. We're going to talk about that on today's episode of Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Stay tuned. We're going to talk about it very soon. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I am your host, Andrew Loon. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about COVID, but we're going to talk about fisheries in COVID and small-scale fisheries and sustenance fishery. A word that I never really say properly, sustenance fishing. Essentially, I believe it's defined by the term is defined by grabbing food for yourself, basically. In this case, fishing. So you're fishing for your own food, not to sell, maybe to sell to some people, but not many people, not for commercial purposes, but essentially to get food. And in this case, in the Aleutian Islands, there were people that were going after conch, which is a big snail, basically a massive snail that is a huge fishery in the Caribbean islands, and we're in one of the Bahama Islands, so on the outskirts of the Bahama Islands, and part of Bahamas. And we're talking about people going out during COVID, not sure if they have access to food because they weren't sure if shipping was actually going to happen. It ended up having to happen, but people were still going out and fishing for conch without really worrying about size restrictions and everything like this. Maybe they weren't just fishermen, they were just, sort of everyday people, like not focused on fisheries every day. And so, we're going to talk about that. Dr. Nick Higgs, who's with us today, reached out to me and said, hey, I want to talk about this story because I just published it. And it's something that I think he thinks is really important. I agree with him in looking at what happens when it really hits the fan and you don't have access to food and we have the ocean and we go after, population. So we're going to talk about that in this episode. And I'm going to kind of talk about it at the end of the episode too, sort of my thoughts on this thing. Nick was amazing for being on here and providing all his insights, so I want to thank him for that. But here's the interview. I want you to listen and let me know what you think after this, but I'll be talking after this interview, so stay tuned. Enjoy the interview. I'll talk to you soon. Hey, Nick, welcome to the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Are you ready to talk about fisheries during a pandemic?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. I am so excited to have you on the podcast. This is actually the first time we've met. I think we've had some emails back and forth, but you contacted me about this really interesting study that you published on. And it was all about fisheries, small scale fisheries during the pandemic. And obviously it's relatable to today. We're still in this pandemic, unfortunately. Last year, 2020 was a very panicky moment for a lot of us. Fortunately, I live in North America and it's a big island. And so, we have access to food all the time. Other than toilet paper, which I think was that and Lysol wipes, which is the only commodity that wasn't really around. We never really had to worry about gaining access to food. But there are other places that did, including Cape Eleuthera, where you live, that were concerned about that for a temporary time, and I think that led to this paper. So I'm really excited to hear this story that you're about to tell us in terms of what you sort of observed in the study that came out of it. So super excited. We're going to get into all of that, but before we do, Nick, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, like who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Hey, I am Dr. Nick Higgs. I'm director of the Cape Eleuthera Institute, which is the kind of research arm of the Island School here on the island of Eleuthera in the Bahamas. I grew up on North Eleuthera, but I kind of sound like this because I lived and worked in the UK for a while before I got to move back to the Bahamas and take over running this fantastic place.
I never realized that you grew up in North Eleuthera. That's an interesting way of growing up. What was that like for you? Were your parents from the UK, or did they grow up in North Eleuthera as well?
Oh, it's awesome. It's probably the best childhood you could have, and one of the reasons I'm back is to kind of give my kids some of that. My dad goes way back to some of the earliest European settlers in the Bahamas, and my mother is British, came over here to teach. So I'm a kind of half British, half Bahamian. But no, my roots go way back. And, I come from a long line of fishermen. My dad, my three brothers, all my uncles are all fishermen. So it's kind of near and dear to my heart for sure.
It must give you an interesting perspective when you study, fisheries, as well, as having a family of fishermen sort of in that generational line. That's got to give you an interesting perspective. When you went into this type of work, what were your parents thinking? Were they like, oh, hold on a second, don't you want to go into fisheries? Like, did they support it? Or they said, hey, maybe we can catch more fish if you know more? How did that work?
Yeah, I mean, well, they were just big believers in education and sacrificed a lot for me to be able to go away to school and to university. And, some people were skeptical. I remember people telling me, oh, you're just going to come back and be a fisherman. It's not really worth it. And I said, well, yeah, maybe I'll be a fisherman with a degree. But, and no, I loved it. That was my teenage job, working on the fishing boats. And I learned a lot from the fishermen. And in fact, still am. And that's kind of the reason I'm doing some of the stuff I do today on sustainable lobster fisheries here in the Bahamas. So this kind of story is really, though, not about the lobster fisheries. It's about conch, which is this kind of amazing marine animal that is a huge part of Bahamian culture. It's on our national coat of arms. It's the logo of my institute. It's and it's been part of the diets of people here, from the Tiano people who first kind of occupied these islands before Columbus arrived, all the way up till today. It's a huge part of the culture and the diet here. So something like, I'd say 70% of Bahamians eat conch once a month. And
wow.
It's something that tourists come to try. It's on every menu in the restaurants. And we probably have one of the last productive fisheries in the region. A lot of places it's been kind of fished out. So it's also a species that is at risk, but it's a huge part of the culture here.
And I assume like this is conch is pretty popular around the Caribbean as well. But having such a small island, how big is the island?
So Eleuthera is this kind of 100-mile, very long and skinny island. It's really the crest of an ancient sand dune. So we've just got this kind of long, skinny island right at the edge of the Atlantic. So on one side, you've got the deep Atlantic dropping off to thousands of meters. And then on the other side, you have this very shallow Bahama bank. And that's one thing the Bahamas has a lot of shallow bank area that is perfect for supporting populations of conch and lobster and reef fish.
So having this type of island, a smaller island, it's ideal for these types of shallow species. So fisheries is pretty big. Is the fishery heavily regulated in this area in terms of catch sizes and quotas and so forth? Because obviously, even though it's big, you don't want to run out and you want to make sure it's sustainable. So how is that managed in the Bahamas?
The fisheries are really kind of mainly managed through fisheries officers, inspectors who kind of regularly carry out inspections. And there are regulations on the size of the animals that you can take. So for conch right now, one of the big regulations is that it's based on the shape of the shell. So it has to have this big flared lip. The shells, are probably like over 15 centimeters long. So they're pretty
Right.
big when they're fully grown. But really, it's only the kind of commercial or artisanal fisheries that get regulated, because one of the things that's really difficult is that's a lot of coastline on an island that's 100 miles long, but only about a mile wide on average. That's a lot to
Yeah.
cover for one fisheries officer. And then when you're considering that most of the fisheries that's going on here is small scale, it's not like the big scale industrial fishery that's happening out of the capital. These are mostly individual guys going out in little Boston whalers, boats, dinghies, less than a mile offshore at most, and coming back and processing their catch really wherever they launch the boat from. So it is pretty tricky to actually regulate. And so there's a lot of concern right now about overfishing of conch in the Bahamas. But like I say, it's such a huge part of our culture that I think it's really important that we get a handle on that and make sure that it is being fished sustainably.
And I assume, like, the fishers and the fishing community within Cape Eleuthera are worried about that as well, and they want to make sure it's as sustainable as well, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We work with fishers, that go out with our students and kind of show them how the fishing's done, teach them about the conch and the culture. In fact, the local community here has a conch fest every year when there isn't COVID.
Yeah.
And like the fishermen say, every fisherman I know, being from a fishing family, they want this to be able to sustain future generations. No fisherman I know is purely interested in just getting as much as they can. What they want to make sure that they have an interest in this as much as anybody else, that this continues to be this resource there into the future.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to provide that distinction, because I think fishers get a bad rap when we talk about fishing in general. I think a lot of people think that artisanal fishers, they lump them in with sort of the larger companies and corporations that fish for the greed, whereas artisanal fishers are more there for sustenance, sometimes to pay for their livelihoods and so forth, and they're not making a ton of money, but they love what they do and they do it well. So I want to make sure we got that distinction in, because it's different in every place. So it's good to know that. You mentioned COVID. You mentioned pre-COVID. There's these festivals. And I kind of mentioned at the beginning of this episode when we started this interview, being in a city close to like Toronto here in Canada, you never really have to worry about running out of things. It's never really a concern. But living on an island, the size of Cape Eleuthera, or any island just for that matter, you have to worry about, you probably get a lot of things shipped to you, in terms of food and items and so forth. I mean, Amazon's probably not going to do its Prime and then next day delivery, to get there. It's got to be a challenge just in the general level. During a pandemic, were there concerns about food scarcity when the pandemic hit?
Yeah, we had real concerns about food scarcity because the Bahamas actually imports more food than most other countries in the Caribbean, even for an island nation. We don't have the best soil for farming. There's a few things that grow well: mangoes, pineapples, tomatoes. But other than that, we import like 95% of our food. So when we start hearing stories about food scarcity in places like the US and Canada, where almost all our food comes from, you think, oh, well, we're definitely at the back of the line. So if this food, if food's getting scarce over there, then we're definitely going to be in trouble here potentially. And so that at the very early days of the pandemic, I don't know, if your listeners can cast their minds back to those early days when things were just really uncertain, that was all the more so here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for us, it was more of like, oh no, for some reason there's no toilet paper anywhere. We can't find toilet paper, or we can't find Lysol wipe. I couldn't imagine thinking or being concerned about the fact that, oh, there may not be food, or we may not have certain items available to us. That is definitely a concern, and more of a panic than toilet paper, and so was there a shortage in food, or did it end up being just more of a worry at the beginning, and then all of a sudden things started to come through, like the government initially thought or hoped?
Yeah, I think what we were worried about is whether shipping would carry on, but
Hmm.
actually it did, and there were some shortages initially, especially on some of the more remote islands, like where I live, and even further afield in the Bahamas. But in the end, it was okay. But I think nothing was really certain for a good few months, until after the start of the pandemic. There was definitely a good month or two of real uncertainty as kind of stocks just ran down.
Right.
And at our place, we actually, because we kind of run big educational programs, we went through our inventories and we're kind of thinking about, okay, worst case scenario, how do we ration stuff? How much have we got here? It was, and we're a pretty well resourced organization, but even we were getting to that level.
Yeah, which is really interesting to have to think about that. You never, uh, I mean, obviously, we never thought there'd be a global pandemic, but you also never thought that you'd have to worry about your food source, and just sources in general for anything. I mean, some of the things that we were short on, just in terms of supply chains, here in Canada, apparently hot tubs were, I guess people decided to buy a lot of hot tubs because they're spending more time at home, and you couldn't get a hot tub if you wanted a hot tub. Like this weird things like that, weren't available because things weren't being created, because warehouses were shut down, and so forth. So, were there any items like that were like really weird, that you were like, oh, how come this makes sense? It's not available, but I'm surprised that this is in such high demand.
I guess things. I mean, we're used to not having things like, here it's kind of like, oh, this came on the boat this week. Sometimes it doesn't come, so you don't get it.
Right.
I think there was some like certain cereals like my kids were kind of didn't really understand. It's like no more, oh, you got to have a different breakfast cereal, and they're like, what?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No more
like that
Lucky
kind of thing.
Charms.
Yeah, yeah.
Gotcha. All right. Well, it does make it interesting though to think about this, because this kind of goes into the story of what you started to observe. So why don't you start telling us a little bit of what you observe happening on Cape Eleuthera, sort of during your own sort of observations, probably out for walks because you guys did get locked down, right? So why don't you just kind of tell us a little bit of what happened during that time?
Yeah, sure. And it's a kind of important part of the story is understanding the timeline that here in South Eleuthera, a lot of the economy is based around the cruise ship industry. We have two cruise ports, and actually a pretty small population. So that is a huge employer here. And if you remember, like cruise ships were some of the first things that got shut down. So
Yeah.
very early on, we had about 200 people laid off like overnight, here on South Eleuthera. And so combining that with all the stuff we've just been talking about food insecurity and other things, um, there was a kind of, I guess, a real worry, just general worry about how things are going to turn out. What's going to happen? Where's food going to come from? Where's the next paycheck going to come from? And not long after the cruise ship stopped, we got lockdowns. Our institution had to close down and cease operations, and this was, like a real lockdown. We were only really
Hmm.
allowed out to get essentials like food, um, and medication. And interestingly, one of the other things was that people were allowed out to go fishing, if it was for food. So they could go to the food store, or they could go to the sea. And it turns out
Interesting.
that's actually something people have done here for a long time. And when we talk about worry and panic around food, I think there's also a kind of general attitude of like, well, yeah, but there's always the sea. Um, and one thing we started to see here was people kind of using that. So, just off the coast here of where I live here at the Institute, there's about a mile-long stretch of beach and rocky shore where people just kind of walk into the water and go foraging for these conch, these big marine snails that have a good chunk of meat inside them. And we just started noticing more and more people out there every day. Typically you might see a couple of people out there every few weeks going out to get a few. But
this is like
what
pre-COVID.
Yeah, pre-COVID, maybe like somebody out there once a month, every couple of weeks. But this turned into every day, and not just a couple of people. Sometimes it'd be 5 people, 8 people out in groups, like really foraging. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Something's going on here. And I couldn't be doing my normal research, because we kind of shut down operations. I couldn't use a boat. I couldn't do anything. And I was like, somebody needs to document this. Maybe, I'm going to document it. Let's start measuring stuff. The scientist in me came out was like, hey, I need some numbers on this. Like, what's going on? And because I didn't have anything else to do as well, I was on lockdown and shut down. So really thought, and not only that, hey, this is an interesting little thing happening here, but kind of realizing that this is probably happening on islands all over the Bahamas, all over the Caribbean as well. In these kind of rural areas that are next to the sea, that have always depended on the sea, this is probably happening. So I kind of started this study to really try and quantify something in this, maybe our little niche part of the world, but that's probably happening in a lot of other places too.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think what's interesting too is, the people are waiting in this water and they're looking for these conchs. They're not hard to catch, are they? Like you don't require traps like a lobster or something like that. You can just go and just grab one, and then you put them in what do you do? Put them in a mesh bag or like a diving bag, or even I'm sure you can do it in hopefully not, but a plastic bag or something. But you just have some kind of container, and then you can just walk away with it. Is that how it's done?
Yeah, what we saw was that the fishers, and it wasn't just men, it was family groups that looked like family groups, men, women, and they'd go out with maybe an old cooler, so like an old ice chest, and that floats, and so they'd tow that around and just kind of have a mask on, looking around, and pick them up, put them in the cooler. So yeah, you're right. These things are not fast. They're very slow moving. They're big. Their defense is they're big, huge, thick shells. So they don't need to be able to move fast. They carry their arm around. So they're easy to catch, easy to see. And in some places, like this area, fairly abundant. So yeah, people were just out there wandering around. And then they put them in the cooler and then bring them all back to shore to break open the shells and get the animals out. And then they leave the piles of shells by the shore. Because there's this theory that the fishermen have that the conch actually run away from the dead shells. So if you throw the dead shells overboard, you'll drive the conch away from the fishing grounds. So they actually bring the shells in, and you'll see this all over the Caribbean, piles of these shells wherever there's a conch fishery. So what I realized is that actually these shells provide a lot of information. So the fishermen would just take the meat away and leave the shells. And then with my scientist hat on, I went along every week and picked up all the new shells from this kind of mile-long stretch of coast, brought them back to the Institute and would measure all of them, take measurements from all of them to get a handle on like how much conch is being taken, what are the size of the conch being taken, what's the trends. And so because they have these hard shells, you can actually get tons of interesting information out of that.
Yeah, it is interesting. I have to ask though, as these shells are being crushed and here you are picking up the pieces and putting them back, were you trying to put them back as a puzzle to find out the individuals?
So no, they don't get broken into pieces. So this is part of how you get the animal out. You make a small slit in the spire of the shell, either with an axe or a knife, like a machete. And then you stick a knife in and detach the animal from the coil of the shell and just pull it out.
Gotcha.
So the shell is pretty much intact, other than this kind of hole that's in the spire of the shell. And that's how I could tell that this was definitely a shell that was the result of fishing, and not, say, a natural predator that had been along and eaten a load of conch. You can very much tell that this shell is... Now, some of them, they did break the end off or did get broken up. And so those ones, you kind of have to take whatever measurements you can and then kind of extrapolate. But most of them are pretty much intact.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, like, what were the final numbers? Do you remember how many actual animals you... don't mean to put you on the spot or anything to look it up.
No, absolutely.
I'm just curious, like, are we looking at hundreds? Or are we looking at...
So in a 12-week period, I personally measured 1,600 conch shells for length, thickness, everything. So that's the other thing, because the kind of the nature of the project, this was just me. This is my first single author paper. And, when you're director of an institute, you don't often get to get your hands that dirty, But so it was kind of fun for me to get actually down into it. And, there's no interns measuring their shells. This was just me, 1,600 shells in 12 weeks. But I didn't have too much else to do.
Well, that's it. I mean, you're in a good place. You're doing what you want to do. You're getting your hands dirty per se and measuring. I mean, it's kind of like a marine biology experiment, looking at trends and stuff. And I think that's really interesting. So what did you find in terms of the results?
Yeah, that was, so as well as just the overall number, it was more interesting looking at the trends over time. And what we saw is, like, for the first 3 weeks, we were regularly finding 200 to 250 shells per week being taken. And so just for reference, that's about 12 to 14 kilos of conch meat every week. And then after the first kind of 3 weeks of the lockdown, that number dropped sharply down to about just 50 shells per week, or about 4 kilos of meat. And then it kind of dwindled off for the remainder of the lockdown. So there was this kind of period of intense fishing right at the start of the pandemic for the first 3 weeks, when I think people were kind of panic fishing, when they were unsure about what was going to happen, how long this was going to last, how long were they going to be out of a job, was there going to be any more food? So everybody was like, right, let's get fishing, get what we can right now, because who knows what the future holds.
Yeah.
And then I think after a few weeks, people could see that, okay, the food's not going to stop coming in. The ships are still coming. There's food on the shelves. And also importantly, the big drop-off in fishing happened at the same time as there was a kind of partial reopening of stores, that there was curbside stores could open. So, for the first few weeks of the pandemic, it was like food stores and kind of pharmacies, and that was it. And then as things kind of opened up a little bit more, you saw things tail back off to normal levels. So that was pretty interesting, being able to capture those trends in those kind of numbers as well. But another interesting thing was that the actual size of the conch steadily did decline over that whole 12-week period. So I think what we did see was that, that intense period kind of took a lot of the biggest individuals first. And then after that, they were kind of working their way down into what ended up being some pretty small individuals. And in fact, probably about 90% of the catch was smaller than the legal threshold, which, these are extraordinary times, right? People are kind of uncertain about food. You're not necessarily worrying about kind of sticking exactly to fisheries regulations, especially if you're fishing to get food for your family. This isn't,
right.
selling it on in the market or something.
Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting as well to see that happening in real time.
Yeah, I mean, it really opens it up to a lot of questions. Obviously, intense fishing we know can really affect a population. Of whatever is being harvested, whether it be spiny lobster, whether it be conch. You've basically shown that based on 1 year of data, saying, hey, look, the size of them got smaller. The fishing pressure lessened as things started to open up, but there's definitely a danger if it did go on for a long time, that this population can be severely affected. It's one generation, maybe it's a disturbance, 3 weeks. You can kind of call it maybe a natural disturbance, or similar to a natural disturbance, and hopefully the population will rebound. But if this happens more often, or if food scarcity ever happens again, God forbid, to this area, then we know what's going to happen. People are going to turn to the sea, turn to the conch. And how long is this population going to last without any regulation, without any worries? Is this a question that concerns you, or a result that concern, or even a trend that concerns you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about this spot was that my predecessor, the actual very first paper produced by this institute, was looking at this same fishery in the same spot. So we had really good data to compare it with from 2003. And we saw that, back in 2003, the very smallest size classes of these animals accounted for 10% of the catch. And then pre-lockdown, that had gone up to maybe 12 or 14%. During the lockdown, that went up to 35% of the catch with these very small animals. So that was definitely a worry. And we know that this area as well, the stocks have been declining a little bit. And now, what happens in an emergency, that is kind of different to normal everyday fishing, right? So, but part of the worry is that, that kind of coping mechanism becomes normalized. That suddenly, where, fishermen would not really think about taking animals that are super small.
Right.
Once it's been done once, it's kind of under these extreme circumstances that it becomes a kind of a normalized behavior. And that, I think, is a little bit of a worry. I think overall, this is a kind of small patch in the kind of bigger picture of the fishery. But if it's happening all over the place as well, then maybe it is a real concern. I mean, it's kind of hard. I don't kind of blame people or judge anybody for doing this in kind of a pandemic situation. But I think, yeah, obviously what's obvious is that you can't keep fishing like this if we want to make sure that there's conch for the future. And I think that's the real question, right? It's obvious that this fishery has provided this kind of safety net for people in these kind of hard times. So when they're kind of faced with uncertainty, people are kind of relying on the sea. They think, okay, I know at least I can go out and just get some seafood and feed my family. And the question is, hopefully they will continue to be able to do that into the future, because one thing we do know is that, it might not be a pandemic, but it might be a hurricane next time that causes a similar level of disruption. And like that, unfortunately, that the Bahamas suffered in 2019 with Hurricane Dorian. So we know that hurricanes are going to continue to be a thing, especially with climate change. We're going to see more intense hurricanes. And I think the big thing that weighs on my mind is, are people always going to be able to turn to the sea for this food source? And that throws up all kinds of ethical dilemmas about how we manage the fishery, because the people who are doing this kind of subsistence fishing are the people who don't have access to boats to go out to the offshore fishing grounds where there's bigger animals. These are people that can only really access the shoreline, where they can just walk in and forage on what probably is a nursery ground. And so the people who are kind of most dependent on that resource are also the ones who are probably facing the most food insecurity. So it's really tricky. And one thing we're hoping to do is, I'm kind of collaborating with social scientists and applying for funding to really dig deeper into what really was driving this, and what do people think about the future of the fishery, and what do they want for the future. Because one thing I had to consciously do during this study was I kind of made a decision not to engage with the fishers themselves while they were doing this. Firstly, for quite a number of reasons, but firstly, I wanted to get an accurate picture of what was happening on the ground and didn't want to deter people. It was immediately obvious that a large proportion of this fishery was illegal sized. And I didn't want people to feel like they were being judged or studied or monitored or anything.
Of course.
So I kind of, and then ethically, when you're dealing with people who are potentially breaking laws, you don't want them to be identifiable. So it's better if you don't know who the exact people are. Now that there's kind of time's passed and it's after the fact, we're ready to go to the community and start talking to people about it. And there's that kind of gap there that offers that protection, So, if the kind of Bahamian fisheries officers come and say, "Oh, why didn't you report this?" or anything, I can say, "Well, I don't have any names. I just was studying the biology." So,
well, and especially when it's for people who are doing it for survival. You know what I mean? It's not as if they're doing it to sell them on an illegal trade or anything like that. They're doing it to, they might have sold it a little bit to neighbors or so forth, but for the most part, they were doing it to eat it at home so that they had food. So I think I agree with you. It's difficult to engage with them, to ask them like, why are you doing this? What are you going to do with them? That kind of stuff, because there's probably a bit of a formal judgment there, and they may not be in the best case. COVID affected a lot of people, and you just don't know what the mental health of people or sort of the thought process of people, and judging them is not going to help, or appearing like you're monitoring them is not going to help. But I am curious to find out, if the people who were doing this substance fishing, if they were concerned, or if they noticed a decline in the size. Some people may have noticed, some people may not have noticed. It all depends on how many people were involved and so forth, and if they had an eye for it, and if they were concerned at all, if that was going to happen for the long term.
I mean, I think we were just monitoring this over 12 weeks, and I don't think they might have necessarily noticed the decline in size, or because it was kind of subtle. What was interesting is that you can tell individual fisher behavior based on the individual piles of shells. So each fisher would kind of leave a discrete pile. And there were clearly some people who went out of their way to only take really big ones. And then there were others who had lots of really small ones. And there were others that had a mix, and they just were clearly not too bothered. So you could actually even kind of see that some people knew what they were doing. Some people maybe didn't even have a clue what the regulations were, and some people didn't care. And, like I say, there's no judgment there. But it was interesting that you could pick out that kind of behavior, even again, just from the shells that were left behind.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting sort of thing to monitor. Would you ever be curious of or were you ever curious of if you had monitored it now, did the same kind of study, but more in water? Because I'm assuming not as many people are actually, coming back and doing this kind of thing. But I wonder if you ever wondered if you're going to do it in water to see how many are not fished or how many are fished, to see a decline a year and a bit later, if that actually happened.
Well, that's right, because if you're fishing the kind of early size classes, then you might not expect to see any kind of population trends and for a couple of years onwards. So yeah, the hope is that we will continue to do in-water monitoring as well. We've done a number of kind of monitoring efforts over the last decade here, just as part of the Institute's routine work, and we'll continue to do that. What's interesting is that this area is on the books to become a marine protected area, or particularly a marine managed reserve. So that's somewhere where fishing activity will probably almost certainly be allowed, but it's recognized as a really significant area for fisheries stocks and fisheries recruitment. So that kind of work will almost certainly happen here if that's designated. But what I'm really excited about is making that a kind of community managed area. If we have any say in it, that's what I would like to see, is more kind of community involvement in that area. And that's why it kind of excites me, is because up until now, fisheries management in our country has been something that's been very centralized. So it's central government, and then there's like a fisheries officer. But what I find very interesting about this is that we might for the first time kind of be having actually the local fishers, the local communities actually directly involved in the management of this patch. And so I think that's going to be the way forward to ensure that there is, conch into the future, is to get people involved in that aspect of it as well.
Absolutely. I think I agree with you completely, especially having, you're kind of on your own, even though you have the Bahamian government, physically you're on your own. And so it'd be better to have a local management team there that know the area, that could work with the one fisheries regulation officer, but that they can monitor it together. I find that, I think from the literature, from what I know, it ends up being a lot more successful. But talking about a marine management area is really interesting, because we obviously never know if a pandemic's ever going to hit again or anything like that, where it would cause any kind of food scarcity. Obviously, there's a lot of things happening in the world today: forest fires, floods, things like that could drive people to have to search for their own food. Having a marine managed area would protect the population as it is today, not only for future generations, but if there's ever an emergency like that, hopefully that would have it would be a much more resilient population to these types of takes, where if it is a temporary situation, the resiliency would allow that population to recover a lot faster. So I think having this area is almost like an extra reason to have it, to be here, just in case, something like this ever happens again. Hopefully it won't, but just in case, right?
Yeah, we use the analogy of a natural insurance policy,
Yeah.
and we kind of seem to put a kind of economic value on all these different ecosystem services. And I think that's one that we really need to consider, certainly for rural communities like this, that, hey, think, if a hurricane hits or there's another disaster, that this provides some kind of social security safety net. And things would be a whole lot worse if people didn't have that resource to turn to. So hopefully, that governments and, the communities will see that and hopefully be an encouragement for valuing these marine ecosystems and making sure that the resources are well looked after.
Yeah, no doubt. Just to kind of get in a perspective and just to go over it, the next step in this sort of process is you're applying for funding with some colleagues, some collaborators, to do more of a social science study, which would be more of engaging with the people who participated in this type of sustenance fishery. So can you just tell us a little bit about that, like what you're planning, what you and your collaborators are planning in terms of engagement?
Yeah, sure. And it's important to say, like, again, I'm just a kind of humble biologist, and I think it's important to involve experts when you're doing this work. So that's why I kind of turn to colleagues and collaborators. And what we're planning to do is to kind of scale this up a bit and look at the role of subsistence fishers in different communities throughout the Bahamas. So where I am is an incredibly rural population. The nearby town is only about 500 people. And compare that to somewhere like Nassau, the capital city, which is a huge city population. The experience of lockdown in those two different places was very different. But also, subsistence fishing was one of those one of the only things you could be out of your house for. So there were a lot of people who were out subsistence fishing who didn't necessarily need to be for food, but
something to do.
Something to do, go out sports fishing.
Yeah.
So this kind of subsistence fishery provided a kind of release for a lot of people in lots of different ways. So not only are we hoping to get a better picture of what the drivers and motivators were for the fishing that was going on in our community here, but also then in very different types of communities across the Bahamas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be a really interesting study to see. I look forward to having you and your collaborators back to talk about the results of that study. Fingers crossed it gets funded. I think it's really important. I think we do need to find out these types of answers, and how it affected different parts of the wonderful country of Bahamas and all of the people, because there are different people, in each island that live differently, and so that will be affected. But it'll be a great study, no doubt. And again, like I said, Nick, it'd be great to have you and your collaborators back to explain some of the results and some of the trends that you found, to find out more about this interesting study. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to having you back, and good luck out there in the Bahamas. I know it's probably pretty hot right now, but I definitely envy you for living on such a wonderful, wonderful island.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's hot, but it's a wonderful place to live, and very glad to be here. So hopefully we'll get to chat to you next time.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Nick, for joining us on the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Really appreciate it. It just really goes to show that, there's so many different things hitting COVID. And when these things kind of hit, we need to make sure that the resiliency is in place, just like Nick and I spoke about during the interview. And I want to kind of reiterate that because I think it's really important. I think it's important that we know that strong populations of fish, of snails, whether it be mollusks, of invertebrates, whether it be mollusks, whether it be crustaceans, whether it be whatever that we eat, are strong, because people are going to depend on it, whether they're following fisheries regulations or not. And hopefully these sort of events are very short-lived, just like this one was only 3 weeks, it seems. But where the hard-hit times are met with resilient populations that are able to handle these short disturbances in human pressure and human activity and fishing. So I just thought it was a really interesting interview. I hope you enjoyed it too. Let me know what you think. Go to speakupforblue.com, our website. Click on the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast link. It's just the cover art image, and it'll go to that website for that show, because it is a podcast network show. And leave me a message, what you thought, whether it be a voicemail with the little microphone in the bottom right corner, or you can leave me a written message and I will cover it. So I thought this will be pretty interesting to cover. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can also DM me on Instagram at SpeakUpForBlue. I'd love to respond to you there. Give me about a day or so to respond. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us here on the Marine Conservation Happy Hour. That's not it. It's the podcast show. It's the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Thank you for joining me here on the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon, and happy conservation.